Deep beneath the cliffs of Qumran, where the desert winds bury secrets faster than history can uncover them, there lies a cave so narrow that only a single person could ever enter at a time. Inside that cave, long before any scholar drew near, the silence was absolute. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, only the shadows waited. And in those shadows rested a scroll. Its surface was cracked by centuries, its ink fading like the last memory of a forgotten world. Dust clung to it in thick layers, as if the earth itself tried to hide it. But the moment the scroll was gently unwrapped, one truth became unmistakable. These were not a man removed from the world by divine hands, a man whose departure defied every natural law, a man believed to have seen what no ordinary mortal was ever meant to witness. And so the question echoed through early Christian communities generation after generation. If God took Enoch alive, what did he show him? What visions were burned into his eyes? What knowledge did he bring back? Knowledge so heavy that later believers feared its implications. The scroll found in that desert cave hints at answers. It contains visions of heavenly beings, accounts of ancient rebellions, and glimpses of a future that startled even seasoned teachers of the early church. These writings crossed boundaries between the physical and spiritual in ways other texts did not dare to. Some Christians read these passages and felt the ground shift beneath their beliefs. Some saw reflections of events described only briefly in Genesis. Some believed it explained the corruption that forced the world into judgment, and some feared what it implied about the future. Yet this prophecy, this powerful revelation, was never fully erased. It survived in fragments, in ancient traditions, in whispers, and in communities that guarded it when others dismissed it. Today, we stand at the threshold of that same mystery. A forgotten scroll in a lonely cave. A book early Christians revered privately. A prophecy too heavy for public recitation. And a man who walked with God until heaven claimed him. This is where the story begins. And so, this is where the story begins. But standing at the edge of this ancient mystery, another threshold rises before us. One not carved in stone, but in questions. Questions the early Christians themselves carried with trembling hands, as if the answers were too bright, too heavy, too sharp to hold for long. Let us walk into these questions slowly, reverently, as though we are stepping into the inner chamber of a forgotten sanctuary. Because the moment we touch the heart of Enoch's writings, three mysteries immediately confront us. They rise like pillars of smoke from the ancient scroll, each one reaching back into antiquity and stretching forward into the unknown. The first mystery presses itself into the mind almost immediately. Why did early Christians fear this prophecy? Why would men and women who faced persecution openly, who endured trials with unshaken faith, who spoke of miracles, angels, and resurrection without hesitation, suddenly grow quiet when the name of Enoch surfaced? What was it about his visions that made them lower their voices? What truth did Enoch claim to witness that even bold believers treated with a kind of sacred caution? When we look into the history, we find something curious. Enoch's writings were known, quoted by early teachers, preserved by communities, and deeply respected by those who studied the origins of spiritual rebellion. Yet, when they discussed it, their tone changed. Their confidence softened into carefulness, as if they stood beside a fire that illuminated everything, but could burn the unprepared. This fear was not superstition. It was not panic. It was recognition. A recognition that this prophecy unveiled something foundational, something that reshaped the way they understood the invisible world. But that is only the beginning. A second question rises, equally unsettling. What exactly did the Book of Enoch predict about the future that startled ancient believers? His writings do not speak in vague metaphors or symbolic riddles alone. They speak of cycles of corruption, of knowledge increasing beyond measure, of human hearts turning in directions that mirrored the days before the Great Flood. They describe spiritual realities hidden from the ordinary eye. They paint images of judgment that feel almost too precise, as if Enoch were standing on the edge of time, watching history unfold like a scroll before him. For early believers, people who expected the return of divine justice, people who felt the tremors of spiritual tension in their world, these predictions were not distant speculations. They were mirrors, reflections, signs that felt dangerously close, too close. It wasn't merely that Enoch described a future. It was that the future he described seemed to echo their present moment, and that realization shook them. But the third question is perhaps the most delicate of all, the one whispered through generations. Why did later church leaders and scholars distance themselves from this book despite its influence? If early communities respected it, if ancient teachers quoted it, if entire regions preserved it with devotion, then why did others step back? Why did councils hesitate? Why did the scroll remain on the margins of the canon rather than at its center? History offers hints, but not condemnation. The struggle was not about dismissing Enoch. It was about discerning how to handle a text whose visions reached far beyond the ordinary rhythm of Scripture. A text saturated with celestial beings, cosmic judgments, and revelations that demanded deep interpretation. Some feared misunderstanding. Some feared misapplication. And some feared the consequences of giving the masses a book filled with visions that required a steady hand to navigate. But none of those decisions erased the fact that Enoch's voice lingered. In the teachings of early Christians, in the echoes found in New Testament writings, and in the spiritual imagination of believers across centuries. These three mysteries stand before us like gates. Why was it feared? What did it predict? Why was it pushed to the edges of official tradition? They form a triad of questions that guide our journey. Each one is a thread tied to the ancient scroll in that quiet Qumran cave. Each one leads deeper into the heart of this forgotten prophecy. Each one invites us to look not only at the past, but at the world around us now. And as we move forward, we will not rush. We will examine each question with care, with reverence, with the same quiet awe that early Christians carried when they handled these writings. Because these questions were not meant to be answered in haste. They were meant to unfold, slowly, deliberately, the way dawn reveals the landscape, not all at once, but inch by gentle inch. We will reach every answer. We will open every door, but not yet. For now, we hold these three mysteries before us and step forward into the deeper chambers of Enoch's ancient vision. Before I unveil the next layer, allow me to speak gently to your conscience. Many people listen to sacred things with casual hearts, receiving revelation, yet leaving no sign that they were ever here. If you are watching this without subscribing, pause. Because heaven witnesses when a soul encounters truth and simply walks away. If this message is stirring you, don't let your silence become part of that quiet forgetting. Subscribe, and let your heart be counted among those who honor what they receive. I step now into the beginning, into the soil where this mysterious book first took root. And I invite you to come with me gently, as though we were walking through the dust of an ancient library whose lamps still burn with the breath of prophets long gone. Because to understand why these prophecies rattled early believers, we must return to the world that birthed them. The Book of Enoch is not a creation of speculation or mythic drift. It is traditionally attributed to Enoch himself, the seventh generation from Adam, an ancestor so enveloped in mystery that Scripture pauses to tell us he walked with God, and then, without warning, was no more. That small phrase, that thin line in Genesis, opened a doorway for generations after him. Because a man who vanished into God's presence is a man whose voice the ancient world believed still echoed somewhere beyond the veil. And so, between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after, the writings that formed the Book of Enoch began to take shape. Pages layered across time, verses stitched from visions, warnings whispered from dreams. It is less a book and more a tapestry, threads woven by scribes who believed Enoch had glimpsed what mortals were never meant to see. During this era, the spiritual imagination of the ancient world was not quiet the way ours often is. It was vibrant, symbolic, mystical. People expected the heavens to break open. They spoke of angels as travelers between realms. They feared and revered divine judgment as something that could enter their lives at any moment, like wind sliding under a door. To them, the unseen was not distant. It was close, thick, breathing. This is the environment in which Enoch's prophecies spread, not like stories, but like tremors. And yet, not everyone read this mysterious book in the same way. Small groups of Jewish mystics held on to it with a fierce devotion, preserving its visions as if guarding a flame. They saw in its pages an explanation for the chaos of their world, an account of heavenly beings descending, ancient rebellions unfolding, and judgments written long before humanity understood the weight of their actions. Far away, In Ethiopia, Christian communities would later preserve the entire text in the Gwizi language, carrying it through centuries untouched, as though God had hidden it in their hands to keep it from vanishing. Even today, those Ethiopian scriptures hold the most complete form of Enoch known to us. And early Christians, especially those familiar with the Epistle of Jude, read Enoch's words with seriousness. Jude quotes Enoch directly, not as symbolism, not as poetry, but as prophecy. This alone reveals something quiet yet profound. The first followers of Christ were not afraid of Enoch. They were shaped by him. But time has a way of shifting the weight of sacred things. As Christianity grew, its leaders began organizing what would become the foundational texts of the faith. And while Enoch's influence lingered in sermons, in commentaries, in whispered teachings, the book itself began to feel unsettling to some. Too mystical, too cosmic, too unguarded. A text filled with visions of colossal angels, heavenly courts, and judgments spoken before the birth of nations. It belonged to a world where the veil was thin, where angels walked among men, and where divine mysteries felt close enough to touch. That world was fading. And so, while Enoch continued to cast long shadows across early doctrine, the book slowly slipped from the hands of the larger church. Not erased, just set aside, distanced, moved off stage. But the prophecies remained, the ideas remained, the warnings remained, and the book never stopped whispering. Because the world that Enoch describes, a world expecting angelic interventions, visions, upheavals, and reckonings, is not as distant from us as we like to imagine. And that is why, even now, Enoch's pages feel alive. They feel like a voice returning after thousands of years, asking whether we are finally ready to listen. I will take you deeper in the next section, into the heart of what Enoch actually saw, and why those visions ignited awe and fear in the earliest believers. I continue now from the last breath of silence, moving deeper into the shadowed corridors of the ancient text, into the prophecy that caused early Christians to lower their voices and steady their hands before turning its pages. For here, in the heart of the Book of Enoch, the first revelation rises like a storm approaching from the edge of creation. It begins not with humanity, but with beings older than our oldest memory, the Watchers. They were described as radiant, towering in authority, appointed not to rule the world but to observe it. Their place was meant to be the high periphery of creation, witnesses of human growth, not participants in it. Yet as the ancient narrative tells it, even purity can be pierced by desire, and even heavenly beings can be tempted by what unfolds beneath them. Enoch's writings speak of their descent as something catastrophic, a rupture in the moral boundaries of the early world. It was not a fall marked by thunder, but a choice, quiet, deliberate, and devastating. The Watchers stepped beyond their assigned realm and walked into the world of men, carrying with them knowledge that humanity was never meant to master. The text describes it in tones of sorrow rather than accusation, a teaching that bent creation off its axis. For they revealed arts and secrets, technologies and enchantments. They placed in the hands of early humanity tools that accelerated corruption faster than innocence could resist it. It was not merely information they offered. It was power without the wisdom to bear it. And this was the first prophecy that unsettled the early Christians. Because if the Watchers brought forbidden knowledge, then evil was not born from human imagination alone. It emerged from a fracture in the spiritual order, an invasion, a distortion, a rebellion that predated the flood and echoed long after the waters receded. To those early believers, the implications were staggering. It meant that human corruption did not begin in the garden alone. It meant that a second influence, ancient, luminous, rebellious, had woven itself into the early generations. And it meant that spiritual warfare was not symbolic metaphor, but the continuation of a cosmic unraveling that began long before humanity breathed its first prayer. Early Christian scholars recognized the pattern immediately. The prophecy in Enoch aligned too perfectly with the cryptic lines of Genesis 6, sons of God descending, the world spiraling into violence, creation groaning under the weight of altered destinies. It gave shape to passages that otherwise remained veiled, turning scattered fragments into a cohesive and unsettling story. And then, there was the citation that no devout believer could ignore. The Book of Jude, near the end of the New Testament, quotes Enoch directly. A single passage, brief yet thunderous, declaring the coming judgment upon all, hinting at a rebellion long hidden from plain sight. Jude's acknowledgement was like a fingerprint linking the early church to a text that later centuries would push into obscurity. This connection alone stirred unease. Because if the apostles themselves recognized Enoch's prophecy, why did later generations distance themselves from it? Why was this story, so cosmic, so haunting, moved quietly to the margins? Perhaps the answer lies in the magnitude of the claim. For Enoch does not merely describe angelic rebellion, it reveals its consequences. It places the roots of human brokenness not only in choice, but in invasion. It frames the rise of evil not only as temptation, but as interference. To the early believers, this was not casual information. It was a revelation that altered their understanding of the world's spiritual architecture. And yet, even this is not the full weight of the prophecy. Because what Enoch describes next, beyond the descent of the Watchers, beyond the spread of corruption, beyond the distortion of the early world, would become one of the most debated, feared, and hidden teachings of ancient Christianity. A teaching so profound that some believed it explained not only the first age of the earth, but the final one. A teaching I will unfold soon. But not yet. For this prophecy has layers, delicate, terrible, luminous, and to open them all at once would overwhelm the path we are walking. So I leave you, for now, with the quiet echo of Enoch's first revelation, that the struggle between good and evil did not begin with humanity, that the ancient world was shaped by more than mortal hands, and that what descended in those early days still reverberates across the centuries. In the next section, we will move deeper into the second prophecy, into the truth early Christians whispered about with trembling voices, a truth that reshapes everything we think we know. And so, we step gently from the shadow of Enoch's first prophecy into the quiet places where those early believers wrestled with its meaning. For while the text itself stirred unease, what it revealed shook them far more deeply. It was not merely mystical or symbolic. It was a framework, an architecture of the unseen world that they believed explained realities far older than written scripture. Those first generations of Christians did not treat Enoch as an obscure curiosity. Many saw it as a record of events that truly unfolded in the earliest days of humanity, events that shaped the very structure of spiritual conflict. To them, the descent of the Watchers was not myth. It was the first wound, the first tremor, the first misalignment in the harmony between heaven and earth. And because they believed the story was true, it influenced the way they understood the world's brokenness. You can almost imagine one of those early believers unrolling the fragile parchment in dim lamplight, recognizing in its lines not merely strange stories, but the echoes of the same cosmic struggle they saw hinted at in Scripture. The Watchers, the teachings they brought, the corruption that spread like a stain, this was not a side narrative. To many of them, it was the key that unlocked everything else. Their interpretation was not casual, nor was it dominated by fear. Instead, it was shaped by a kind of solemn realization that spiritual rebellion had history, that evil had ancestry, and that the suffering of the world was not accidental, but part of a larger fracture stretching back to ancient days. For those early Christians, Enoch became a bridge, one that helped them connect the cryptic moments scattered across the scriptures. The brief mention in Genesis, the reference in Jude, the hints scattered in Peter's letters, these were not isolated fragments. Enoch provided the narrative that linked them. It filled the silences between the verses. And because of that, it shaped their understanding of fallen angels in ways that would leave a lasting mark on Christian thought. Long before theologians formalized hierarchies of demons and angels, long before centuries of commentary tried to categorize the unseen, those first believers saw in Enoch the origin story of spiritual rebellion. It was from this text that many early Christians developed their understanding of what it meant for angels to fall, not as mere symbols of temptation, but as real beings who crossed boundaries and twisted creation. The idea that spiritual forces oppose God, influence humanity, and distort the world's moral compass. Much of this grew from reading Enoch beside the scriptures they already cherished. To them, Enoch explained why the world felt the way it did, why good and evil seemed locked in a struggle that stretched beyond human choices, why suffering felt older than humanity itself, why some battles were not fought on the surface, but in the quiet, unseen places of the soul. The story of the Watchers provided context, a background that framed human experience within a cosmic narrative. It gave shape to the idea that creation was embroiled in a war that began long before our birth, and that humanity was living in the ripples of an ancient spiritual revolt. This understanding did not breed despair. On the contrary, it reinforced their belief that the coming of the Messiah was not merely a historical moment. It was a cosmic intervention, a restoration, a rebalancing of what had been disturbed in the earliest days. To those early communities, Jesus did not emerge into a neutral world. He entered one shaped by rebellion, shadowed by fallen beings, wounded by knowledge never meant to be revealed. And in this way, the teachings of Enoch set the stage for understanding the depth of redemption. This is why the text mattered so deeply to them. It was not entertainment, not speculation, not forbidden curiosity. It was context. It connected the suffering of human life to a larger spiritual history. It explained why the world groaned as it did. It provided a foundation for the belief that the struggle between good and evil was not imaginary, but ancient, ongoing, and intimately tied to humanity's story. And most of all, it gave them language to understand the unseen realm, a language that shaped sermons, shaped prayers, shaped fears and hopes alike. But there was another reason the early Christians held Enoch with such reverence, a reason that moved beyond fascination and into reverent awe. Because if the first prophecy revealed how the spiritual rebellion began, the second prophecy, still ahead of us, revealed how the story would end. A revelation so vast that later generations would hide it, soften it, reinterpret it, or turn from it altogether. And yet the early believers accepted it with trembling clarity. We will step into that prophecy soon. But first, we must understand why this moment, this early response, became the turning point that shaped the entire identity of the ancient church. Only then can the next revelation unfold with the weight it deserves. And so, as the early believers sat with the weight of the first prophecy, its ancient rebellion, its shattering implications, they found themselves turning deeper into the scroll, drawn toward a section that felt unlike anything that preceded it. A portion written with a trembling sharpness, as if the words themselves anticipated a time beyond their own age. It was here, in this hidden passage, that Enoch spoke not merely of distant past, but of an approaching horizon, a generation yet to rise. The script shifts in tone, almost prophetic in its urgency. Enoch describes a world that would be swollen with knowledge, so saturated, so overflowing, that information itself would become a kind of spiritual storm. A world where human understanding would accelerate beyond wisdom, where learning would multiply, but meaning would thin. A place where the mind is full yet the soul feels strangely starved. To those early Christians, living in the simplicity of ancient rhythms, these descriptions felt almost unimaginable. For Enoch spoke of an age bursting with discoveries, innovations, insights, yet somehow marked by a quiet spiritual disorientation. An age where humanity would reach for the heavens with its intellect, while drifting slowly from the grounding of the spirit. It was this contrast that unsettled them most. A future generation, Enoch wrote, would be caught between two realms, bathed in light yet unable to see, surrounded by signs yet unable to interpret them, moving forward with confidence yet unsure of their own foundation. Knowledge increases, but wisdom fractures. Facts multiply, but truth feels distant. To the early believers, it was a portrait of confusion, a spiritual exhaustion beneath the brightness of progress. And then came the part that stirred debate across those early centuries, the passage describing what Enoch called a final purification. The language is layered, symbolic yet piercing, an unveiling, a moment where hidden deeds rise to the surface, not as punishment alone, but as cleansing, a stripping away of illusions, a disclosure of the heart's true nature. Some readers trembled at this, others wept. All of them understood its gravity. For if the first prophecy explained the origins of corruption, this second one exposed the fate of it. A time when nothing kept in darkness would remain concealed, when the spiritual fog of a confused generation would finally dissipate, and something luminous, yet severe, would enter the world like a refiner's fire. Early Christians debated endlessly what this purification meant. Some believed Enoch was describing the last days, the moment when divine judgment steps back into the world, not quietly, but with a brilliance that reveals everything hidden. To them, the prophecy aligned with whispers found later in the Gospels, the notion of a world turning inward, losing its spiritual compass, awaiting a final reckoning. Others saw in Enoch's vision something less apocalyptic and more gradual, a rise of corruption in society, generation after generation, as moral boundaries blur and the line between light and darkness grows thin. A slow erosion, not a sudden collapse. And then there were those who believed Enoch was speaking of both worlds at once. A prophecy that pointed forward with two edges, one toward the climate of human culture, the other toward the approaching horizon of divine judgment. But beneath all interpretations, one detail remained constant. Enoch's second prophecy did not merely warn. It revealed. It stripped away the illusion that spiritual confusion would be a temporary or accidental condition. Instead, it portrayed it as a defining characteristic of a future generation, an age where humanity's advancements would outpace its inner grounding. To the early Christians, this was perhaps the most haunting part of the prophecy. That knowledge itself, if unrestrained by wisdom, could become a kind of burden, a weight pressing upon the spirit, a veil over the heart. And as they wrestled with these words, some among them whispered that Enoch was describing a time far ahead of their own lives, an era that would unfold in distant centuries, when humanity would be surrounded by enlightenment, yet walking in shadows of the soul. They believed the prophecy extended beyond their age, stretching across history like a quiet thread, waiting for its fulfillment. Others believed the prophecy was already beginning to manifest around them, even in small ways, glimpses of a future still forming. But all agreed on one thing. This second prophecy held a mystery larger than their generation could grasp. A mystery meant to be passed forward, carried like a sealed message into the future. Perhaps it was written for another age. Perhaps it was meant for a time when humanity would truly live in the tension between expanding knowledge and shrinking spiritual clarity. Perhaps it was written for us. But that conclusion, that silent realization, belongs to later sections of this unfolding journey. For now, we linger at the threshold of Enoch's second prophecy, its weight, its warning, its strange tenderness, knowing that we have only entered the outer chamber of its meaning. Ahead lies a deeper revelation, one that will bridge ancient prophecy with the modern world and expose why later generations feared, resisted, or concealed these writings altogether. We walk toward that truth soon, very soon. I need to whisper this now, while the revelation is still warm in your spirit. So many souls drift through videos like passing shadows, touched, moved, convicted for a moment, and then gone, leaving no echo behind. Don't let this be another sacred moment you consume, but never confirm. If your heart feels the gravity of what's unfolding, respond. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe. Let there be evidence that this moment changed something in you. And now, as the echoes of ancient prophecy fade into memory, we step gently into the world we inhabit today, a world shaped by knowledge, by information, by technologies that seem to grow faster than the human heart can follow. When modern readers open the Book of Enoch, the resonance is immediate. They sense, almost instinctively, the parallels between Enoch's vision of a generation overrun with knowledge and our own era, where answers are everywhere, yet understanding often feels scarce. The explosion of information, the relentless pursuit of discovery, the way knowledge accumulates faster than wisdom, these are not mere coincidences. To some, they are the continuation of the prophecy, reflected across millennia. And yet, the spiritual confusion Enoch described, its subtle, pervasive presence, has not diminished. In our cities, in our homes, in the quiet of the mind, humans wrestle with questions that once seemed the domain of prophets and seers. Light and darkness meet in the same places. Choices are made with the mind, yet the heart struggles to follow. Enoch's warnings echo now not in parchment and ink alone, but in the rhythms of modern life, in the tension between intellect and intuition, between progress and moral clarity. Some scholars and spiritual seekers have returned to Enoch with renewed interest, drawn not only by fascination with angelology, the the study of angels and watchers, but by the profound symbolic significance of the text itself. The story of the watchers, of forbidden knowledge, of spiritual rebellion, resonates in ways that feel both historical and personal. People study it not only to understand the past, but to interpret their own place within the ongoing struggle between good and evil, light and shadow, clarity and confusion. Yet, as with all ancient texts, interpretations vary. Some see Enoch's prophecies as literal, as warnings of forces that once shaped the world and continue to shape the unseen realms. Others view them symbolically, as a mirror for human behavior, as allegories for the dangers of knowledge untempered by conscience, or the consequences of wandering from divine guidance. Still others approach the text as a bridge, a way to connect the ancient mystical imagination with contemporary spiritual questions, reminding us that human experience, across centuries, shares recurring patterns and echoes. And within this spectrum of understanding lies a subtle balance. The recognition that Enoch is at once historical and symbolic, literal and metaphorical, terrifying and enlightening. His writings invite readers to explore the depths of spiritual reality, while remaining grounded in the lived experience of humanity. They challenge us to consider how knowledge, power, and spiritual awareness interact, and how they shape the moral and spiritual fabric of our lives. For many today, the appeal of Enoch is not in fear, but in illumination. It is a text that encourages reflection, to see the hidden currents in the world, to recognize the consequences of unseen forces, both internal and external, and to understand that the spiritual landscape is never static. It moves, shifts, and tests us, just as it did for the first believers who carefully preserved these words across generations. In this way, the Book of Enoch serves as both a warning and a guide. It reminds us that the struggles of humanity, confusion, rebellion, the tension between knowledge and wisdom, are not new. They have always existed, threaded through time and experience. And yet, it also reminds us that insight, clarity, and redemption remain within reach for those who listen attentively, for those who seek beyond the surface, for those willing to engage with both history and spirit with reverence. So, as modern readers, we can approach Enoch with awe, curiosity, and caution. We can study the watchers, the forbidden knowledge, the unfolding of human and divine history, and recognize the symbolic resonance with our own time. And in doing so, we continue the dialogue between past and present, between prophecy and experience, between heaven and earth. Because the messages that unsettled early Christians are not lost. They persist. They whisper through time, inviting each of us to consider the deeper layers of reality, to reflect on the interplay of knowledge and spirit, and to recognize that the story of Enoch remains alive, carrying questions, warnings, and sacred insight that have traveled across centuries, now arriving quietly in our own hands. And as we prepare to move into the final sections, where we uncover the ultimate implications of these prophecies, the cautionary weight they carry, and the hidden truths that early believers preserved at such cost, we do so with the same reverence that guided those first readers. We approach the mystery not as spectators, but as witnesses, attentive, solemn, and ready to see the threads that connect the ancient world to our own. Because in Enoch's words, the past, present, and future converge, and the spiritual horizon opens before us, waiting to be explored. And now, having traced the first tremor of fear through the hearts of early Christians, we turn to the second loop, the question of the prophecy's startling details, the vision of judgment that stretched across both humanity and the unseen realm. Enoch's writings do not speak in generalities or gentle warnings. They move with clarity and precision, outlining events that reach beyond mere human experience, unfolding into a stage where angels, the watchers, and humanity itself all stand accountable. The early Christians, accustomed to scripture that guided faith with stories and parables, encountered in Enoch a vision so vivid, so intricate, that it unsettled them profoundly. The prophecy depicts judgment as a universal unfolding, a reckoning not confined to earthly deeds alone, but encompassing the hidden intentions and influences that shape life. It speaks of spiritual beings, those luminous watchers who first descended to teach forbidden knowledge, standing before divine authority and accountability. And it speaks of humanity, every act, every betrayal, every corruption, laid bare in a clarity that was almost unbearable. To the first readers, these descriptions were more explicit than many canonical texts. Where other scriptures hint at divine justice, Enoch paints it in sweeping, almost cinematic strokes, the heavens observing, the earth trembling under the weight of judgment, voices of angels and men interwoven in the recounting of truth. It is a judgment that bridges realms, revealing a cosmos alive with moral consequence. Early Christians, reflecting on this, realized something extraordinary. The spiritual conflict they had sensed, the unseen war hinted at in Scripture, was not abstract. It had structure, chronology, and precision. The actions of angels, the rebellion of the watchers, the choices of humanity, all were threads in a pattern that Enoch revealed in detail. This clarity both startled and awed them. It demanded that they acknowledge the full scope of divine oversight, the vast moral architecture of creation, and the ultimate accountability awaiting all beings, seen and unseen. It is perhaps this explicitness that drew both reverence and caution. The prophecy did not merely teach fear of wrongdoing. It illuminated the interconnectedness of spiritual and human realms. It suggested that evil is neither random nor isolated, but the product of choices that echo through creation, influencing destinies in ways subtle and profound. For early Christians, the implications were manifold. The prophecy explained the origins of demonic hierarchies, the persistent presence of temptation, and the ways in which spiritual corruption could manifest in the world. Yet it also affirmed that divine justice was comprehensive. No act, no rebellion, no hidden influence would escape the purifying eye of God. There was both warning and hope, the unyielding consequence of rebellion, and the steadfast promise that truth, eventually, would prevail. The awe it inspired was matched by the careful study it required. These believers read slowly, prayed deeply, and contemplated long nights by candlelight. They understood that this was not a text to be skimmed or taken lightly. Its significance was cosmic, moral, and spiritual, an unparalleled record of both warning and revelation. Early Christians were startled not because the prophecy was fanciful, but because it revealed a truth more expansive, more structured, and more immediate than many of the familiar scriptures. It made tangible the scope of judgment, the interplay between celestial and human realms, and the inevitability of divine reckoning. It is in this understanding that the prophecy's sacred weight endures, a vision that challenges the mind, penetrates the heart, and stretches the imagination across the bounds of time, space, and spirit. It demanded that they acknowledge the full scope of divine oversight, the vast moral architecture of creation, and the ultimate accountability awaiting all beings, seen and unseen. It is perhaps this explicitness that drew both reverence and caution. The prophecy did not merely teach fear of wrongdoing. It illuminated the interconnectedness of spiritual and human realms. It suggested that evil is neither random nor isolated, but the product of choices that echo through creation, influencing destinies in ways subtle and profound. For early Christians, the implications were manifold. The prophecy explained the origins of demonic hierarchies, the persistent presence of temptation, and the ways in which spiritual corruption could manifest in the world. Yet it also affirmed that divine justice was comprehensive. No act, no rebellion, no hidden influence would escape the purifying eye of God. There was both warning and hope, the unyielding consequence of rebellion, and the steadfast promise that truth, eventually, would prevail. The awe it inspired was matched by the careful study it required. These believers read slowly, prayed deeply, and contemplated long nights by candlelight. They understood that this was not a text to be skimmed or taken lightly. Its significance was cosmic, moral, and spiritual, an unparalleled record of both warning and revelation. Early Christians were startled not because the prophecy was fanciful, but because it revealed a truth more expansive, more structured, and more immediate than many of the familiar scriptures. It made tangible the scope of judgment, the interplay between celestial and human realms, and the inevitability of divine reckoning. It is in this understanding that the prophecy's sacred weight endures, a vision that challenges the mind, penetrates the heart, and stretches the imagination across the bounds of time, space, and spirit. To acknowledge this prophecy was to confront a universe alive with struggle, a cosmos in which rebellion could ripple outward from angels to humanity and back again. It challenged everything they thought they knew about evil. They could no longer reduce sin to simple choices or moral failure alone. The prophecy suggested that the cosmos itself had been touched by rebellion, that spiritual warfare was the underlying current shaping every human story, every historical upheaval. And for those early Christians, whose faith was rooted in hope and the certainty of divine order, this was a profound, destabilizing truth. But the fear was not without purpose. It was a fear that sharpened their understanding, deepened their vigilance, and strengthened their reverence. They did not approach the prophecy lightly. It demanded attention, contemplation, and a measured respect for the hidden forces at play. In many ways, the prophecy served as a warning, a spiritual compass guiding believers to recognize the magnitude of the unseen world and the stakes of moral and spiritual choices within it. They feared the prophecy because it revealed the breadth of the conflict, the scale of rebellion, and the fragility of human and angelic obedience alike. And yet, in that fear was also clarity, an invitation to engage with the spiritual reality that Enoch laid bare, to walk with awareness through a cosmos more intricate and more charged than they had ever imagined. In short, they feared it because it was true. It illuminated the hidden battles, the ancient fractures, the depth of human and angelic complicity in the unfolding of creation. And for those first believers, to see the truth of this cosmic struggle was both terrifying and sacred, a fear tempered by the promise that awareness, vigilance, and faith could navigate the turmoil. The universe, as Enoch revealed, was not indifferent. It was alive, embroiled in struggle, and deeply consequential. And that realization, the vivid understanding of cosmic rebellion, was the first loop we set out to resolve. Now that we have held this fear, understood it, and traced its source, we are prepared to step further into the next revelation, the second loop, where prophecy, human experience, and the tension between light and darkness converge more sharply than ever. Having traced the fear of cosmic rebellion and marveled at the staggering detail of Enoch's prophecy of judgment, we now step into the final loop, the question that lingers like a shadow over the centuries. Why did later church leaders, scholars, and scribes distance themselves from this sacred text, a book so influential, so profound, that even apostles once cited it? To understand this, we must imagine the delicate tension of the early church as it matured. Communities were forming doctrines, codifying scripture, seeking unity in a rapidly spreading faith. In this context, Enoch's revelations, so vivid, so precise, so expansive, posed both illumination and challenge. The text spoke freely of angels and their fall, of human corruption tied to celestial rebellion, of judgment that encompassed realms beyond ordinary understanding. It dared to present spiritual truths that were unsettling, almost too vast to contain within the structured teachings emerging in formal scripture. For some leaders, the clarity of the prophecy was its own danger. The revelations could inspire awe, but also confusion, could illuminate, but also unsettle. And so a cautious wisdom arose. The book, despite its power, was gradually removed from widespread teaching. It became esoteric, studied quietly, preserved selectively, respected but kept at a distance. To openly embrace it was to risk unsettling the faithful, to risk exposing complexities of judgment and rebellion that might challenge simpler narratives of divine order. Yet distance did not erase influence. Its echoes persisted in sermons, commentaries, and the theological imaginations of those who wrestled with angels, demons, and the origins of evil. Enoch informed early Christian demonology, shaped concepts of fallen angels, and provided a framework for understanding spiritual warfare, even if the book itself was seldom cited publicly. Some scholars suggest that the very explicitness that startled early readers, its vivid cosmic scenes, its graphic account of judgment, its intertwining of human and angelic fate, made it controversial. The prophecy was uncompromising. It offered no allegorical softening, no gentle metaphors for the uninitiated. It demanded comprehension, reflection, and a readiness to confront truths that could unsettle even devout minds. There is also a deeper, quieter reason. The book, with its ancient origins and mysterious preservation, especially within Ethiopian Christian communities, carried the weight of a world outside the central canon. Its language, symbols, and visions were rooted in a spiritual reality that crossed cultural, temporal, and theological boundaries. To canonize, it would have required reconciling these mysteries with emerging orthodoxy, and perhaps leaders feared that the magnitude of its revelations would overshadow the teachings they were establishing. And so, the choice was made, not to destroy, not to reject entirely, but to relegate it to the periphery, a sacred, preserved secret, studied by those who sought deeper understanding, whispered about in scholarly circles, a bridge between history and prophecy, between the human and the divine. For modern readers, this distancing only adds to the allure. It speaks to the power of the text, the depth of its mysteries, the audacity of its vision. Enoch was too vast to contain, too luminous to simplify, and therefore, for centuries, it remained hidden in plain sight. A treasure preserved for those willing to engage with its truths with reverence, patience, and humility. And so, the final loop resolves into understanding. The book was feared, respected, and preserved, not destroyed. Its knowledge was too potent, its prophecies too revealing, and its cosmic vision too profound to be absorbed casually. The early church recognized the power of its message, and wisely, reverently, approached it with caution. In this way, the three loops, fear of cosmic rebellion, the shocking clarity of future judgment, and the careful distancing by church authorities, coalesce into a single understanding. The Book of Enoch was not merely a story, nor a curiosity. It was a sacred lens into the hidden workings of creation, a text that challenges, teaches, and illuminates, whispering across centuries to those willing to listen. And now, having traced these loops, we stand at the edge of reflection. What does it mean for us today? How do these prophecies, these warnings, these revelations, reach us in an age far removed from the scrolls, yet still caught in the tension between knowledge, wisdom, and spiritual truth? The answer, like all profound truths, is subtle, but it awaits us in the final contemplation, in the quiet reverence of understanding, in the sacred dialogue between past and present. You've walked this far with me, through shadows, symbols, and the soft weight of hidden truths, and that means your spirit is listening. But if you're still not subscribed, it means you're receiving without walking with the message. A visitor, not yet a witness. And witnesses shape the future of revelations like this. If this unfolding has touched even the quiet corners of your soul, let it move you to act. Subscribe, and let your presence be more than a passing footprint on sacred ground. And so, as the echoes of Enoch's predicted judgment faded into the distant horizon of ancient memory, a final question remained suspended above the early Christian world, a quiet question, but one that shaped centuries of debate. Why did later scholars distance themselves from a text so old, so mysterious, so deeply woven into the early spiritual imagination? The answer, like most things in sacred history, is not simple. It unfolds gently, layer by layer, like the peeling back of ancient linen. There came a time when the early church began to gather its writings, to sift through countless scrolls and testimonies, searching for the purest threads that connected believers to the life and teachings of Christ. In that process, Enoch's voice stood in a strange place, too old to ignore, yet too unusual to fully embrace. Some regions preserved it with deep reverence. Others treated it as a poetic companion, a mirror that reflected truths hinted in Scripture but never stated outright. But many scholars, especially in the Western traditions, approached it with caution. Part of the hesitation was simple. It was not universally accepted in every early community. Some churches cherished it, others barely knew it. Unity was considered essential, and Enoch, though widely read, was not universally held. Another reason lay in its visions, vast, symbolic, mysterious. Its imagery stretched far beyond the linear narratives early scholars preferred. It spoke in metaphors that soared above the intellect and deep into the realm of the mystical. Its pages held angels measuring the heavens, stars walking in obedience, cosmic prisons prepared for spiritual beings who stepped outside their ancient roles. It was powerful, but it was not always easy to interpret. Some feared misunderstanding. Others feared misapplication. A few simply feared the weight of the spiritual world it described. And then there was the matter of canon, the formation of a unified standard. Books were chosen based on apostolic connection, clarity of teaching, and widespread acceptance. And Enoch, though ancient and revered, could not offer these particular credentials. Its origins reached back before the apostles, before the prophets, before the flood itself. Its voice came from a time so distant, so deeply rooted in prehistory, that scholars wondered how to situate it within the growing body of Christian writings. But even as it was set aside from formal canon, the book never faded. It continued to breathe in the background, quiet, persistent, unforgotten. It shaped the imagination of believers from Ethiopia to the deserts of Egypt. It whispered through early Christian writings, leaving fingerprints on ideas about angels, demons, cosmic rebellion, and divine justice. Its influence lived in sermons, in traditions, in hidden manuscripts tucked into monasteries where candlelight preserved what history tried to bury. And so, the paradox emerges. The Book of Enoch was never fully embraced, yet never fully lost. It stood between worlds, too mystical to be canon, too foundational to be dismissed. A witness from before the flood, carried through centuries by those who felt its voice still mattered. Even today, its shadow stretches across modern study and spiritual curiosity. A reminder that some truths survive not because they are officially preserved, but because they continue to ignite something in the human spirit. A recognition, a stirring, a sense that the ancient world still whispers through the cracks of time. And that is why scholars step back, and why seekers, even now, step forward. And now, as the threads of prophecy, judgment, and human understanding begin to converge, we arrive at the final, most elusive mystery, a passage so rarely examined, so subtle in its wording, that even the most diligent scholars approach it with cautious reverence. Enoch, in the closing chapters of his vision, speaks of a figure unlike any other, a presence he calls the Elect One. The language is spare, cryptic, almost whispered across the scroll, yet its implications ripple with immense weight. This figure is described as emerging at the end of days, a being enmeshed in judgment, authority, and revelation. But the text offers no explicit identity, leaving interpretation suspended in ambiguity. Some scholars have argued that this Elect One is messianic, a figure prefiguring the Christ anticipated by those early believers, a Redeemer arriving to restore balance, to bring light into the chaos of a fallen world. Others propose a more symbolic reading, that the Elect One represents divine judgment itself, an embodiment of cosmic accountability, a presence that articulates the moral structure of creation in its most final, uncompromising form. Still others suggest a hybrid, a cosmic representative bridging heaven and earth, a figure who mediates between spiritual and human realms, carrying the authority of the divine across both planes. The uncertainty is profound. Unlike the more detailed prophecies of the Watchers or the vivid accounts of judgment, the Elect One remains shrouded, almost ethereal, a silhouette glimpsed at the horizon of Enoch's vision, leaving both awe and unease in those who attempt to discern its meaning. It is a reminder that prophecy, at its deepest level, is never complete in a single reading. It invites reflection, interpretation, and contemplation, demanding that we engage not just with the text, but with the spiritual questions it raises. For early Christians, encountering this passage was simultaneously inspiring and unsettling. The promise of a guiding or judging presence at the end of days affirmed the structure of divine order, but its ambiguity challenged certainty. And for later generations, the Elect One became one of the most debated, yet least cited, elements of Enoch's legacy, a mystery preserved, perhaps, to provoke meditation across ages. And here, in this quiet uncertainty, lies the cliffhanger of our journey. Who truly is the Elect One? What role will this figure play in the cosmic narrative? Will it be a redeemer, a judge, or something beyond comprehension, bridging the human and divine in ways we have only begun to imagine? These questions remain open, suspended between ancient parchment and our own contemplation, whispering across the centuries. They call us to wonder, to reflect, to prepare for a revelation that reaches beyond the limits of history and into the eternal. In the next exploration, we will step carefully into this enigma, tracing the threads that connect the elect one to later Christian writings, to messianic expectation, and to the unfolding vision of redemption and judgment that Enoch first glimpsed. For now, we linger at the edge of understanding, holding in our hearts the awe, the reverence, and the quiet urgency of prophecy. The elect one waits, unrevealed, mysterious, yet profoundly present in the unfolding story of humanity, angels, and the divine plan that stretches across time itself. And as we close this chapter, we are left with a single, weighty truth. Some mysteries are meant to guide us into deeper reflection, to awaken us to the hidden currents of the spiritual world, and to remind us that revelation is never complete, but always calling, always inviting, always sacred. And so, having walked together through the corridors of ancient revelation, tracing the footsteps of Enoch, the Watchers, and the Elect One, we arrive at a quiet moment of reflection. The scrolls have whispered their secrets, the prophecies have revealed their weight, and the mysteries have lingered in the spaces between words. If this journey into lost books, hidden prophecies, and the enigmas of early Christianity has stirred your curiosity, if the unfolding of these sacred truths has awakened something within you, there is a way to continue walking this path. By subscribing, you join a community of seekers, those who are drawn to the quiet power of ancient texts, to the echoes of spiritual revelation, to the profound questions that history preserves but rarely answers outright. Your presence here, in this shared exploration, matters. Liking this video is more than a gesture. It is a recognition of the value of preserving and reflecting upon mysteries that have traveled across millennia. Commenting, sharing your thoughts, or asking questions invites a dialogue across time, connecting your insight with the echoes of those who first read these words in candlelit rooms, in secret, with awe and trembling. In this way, your engagement becomes part of the story itself. You are not a passive observer, but a participant in the ongoing journey of discovery. Each subscription, each click, each thoughtful reflection helps ensure that these sacred mysteries, these hidden teachings, continue to be explored, preserved, and honored. And as we close this chapter, remember this: Enoch's words, the prophecies of the Watchers, the vision of judgment, and the cryptic presence of the Elect One, all of these are more than history. They are living questions, invitations to reflection, and echoes of the sacred that continue to speak to us today. So, linger in these thoughts. Return to them often. Let the mysteries settle in your mind and heart, quietly urging you to seek understanding, to question, and to wonder. And know that there are deeper revelations yet to explore, hidden truths waiting patiently for those willing to listen with reverence, humility, and curiosity. If you wish to continue walking this path, to uncover more lost books, hidden prophecies, and the sacred wisdom preserved across centuries, subscribe, like, and share your reflections below. Together, we keep the dialogue alive, we honor the past, and we step into the eternal unfolding of truth. Because some mysteries, once glimpsed, do not end. They continue, quietly shaping the way we see the world and guiding us toward understanding that is as profound as it is timeless.